Thank you everyone for joining us today. We have a very exciting webinar planned and set up for today. We've got some fantastic speakers, but before we get started with that, I just want to go through a few housekeeping things just to make sure that everyone's logged in correctly for today's event. So if you are logged in correctly, you should be seeing myself and the other panelists online, and you should be hearing my audio. If you are having any audio or video issues, please try logging out of the event and logging back in. If you're using a handheld device or a tablet, you may not be able to see the presentations and the speakers at the same time. You may need to scroll from left to the right to be able to see each speaker and discussion taking place. I do want to let you know that today's webinar is being recorded and will be made available on our YouTube page within a week or so. Also, the National Scleroderma Foundation in no way endorses any drugs, treatments, clinical trials, or studies referred to in today's webinar. Information is provided to keep the listeners informed because the manifestations and severity of scleroderma vary among individuals. Personalized medical management is essential. Therefore, it is strongly recommended that all drugs, treatments be discussed with the individual's physician for proper evaluation and treatment. This webinar is for educational purposes only. At the end of the webinar, we will be going through a Q&A portion, so please be sure to enter all of your questions in the Q&A section. We'll be monitoring that, and at the end of the sessions, we'll jump in for the Q&A portion. I'd also like to introduce our fantastic speakers for today's webinar. Oh, I'm sorry. Before that, I'd like to highlight CareBox while I have everyone here. So CareBox is a fantastic tool that helps connect folks to clinical trials near them. You can access CareBox by going to our website. At the top of the website, if you go to Treating Scleroderma, scroll down to Clinical Trials, click that button, and then Find Trials. It'll take you directly to CareBox. From CareBox, if you click the Match Trials button, you'll be prompted to answer a few questions related to your diagnosis. From there, CareBox will send you a list of trials taking place in your area in which you meet the criteria to participate in. And if you decide that you want to create an account through CareBox, you can actually set it up so that CareBox sends you updates for new trials and upcoming trials that meet your criteria as well. And the best part about CareBox is they do not share your information with anyone. They do not share your information with any trial sites or any organizations. They don't sell any personal information either. They just share the information with you, and it's up to you to take the next step to contact those trial locations directly. So it's a great resource, and please feel free to take advantage of it. I'd also like to thank our generous sponsors for today's event, Amgen Rare Disease and Merck & Co. For sponsoring today's event. Now, I'm happy to introduce our fantastic panelists for today. First, I'd like to introduce Dr. Tracy Frech. Dr. Tracy Frech has been working with the National Scleroderma Foundation for quite a long time. She's won Doctor of the Year and has spoken at many of our events. She's the Associate Professor of Medicine and Director of Division of Rheumatology and Immunology at Vanderbilt University Medical Center, and she will be presenting the clinical trials talk for today. I'd also like to introduce Abdul Rehman. He's the Clinical Research Coordinator for the Department of Medicine and Division of Rheumatology at Northwell Health, and he'll be sharing his expertise in working with individuals through the clinical trial process daily. And lastly, I'd like to introduce our patient speaker, our patient voice for today's webinar, Kheesa Jones. Kheesa Jones has been working with the National Scleroderma Foundation for many years and has shared much of her journey with us. With that, I'd like to ask Kheesa Jones to jump on and share a little bit about her story with scleroderma.
Hello, welcome. My name is Kheesa, and I started having symptoms of scleroderma in 2005. I went to numerous doctors, and it took about a year, and I was formally diagnosed with scleroderma in July of 2006. And here I am 18 years later, still going strong. I'm hanging in there.
Thank you, Kheesa. And you absolutely are going strong. It feels like every time I see you, you're up to a kind of a new adventure. I'd love to learn a little bit more about kind of your experiences with clinical trials. Would you like to tell us a little bit about how you first heard about clinical trials?
Right. Well, I was going to my rheumatologist for scleroderma, and the first clinical trial that was brought to my attention came through his office. Several of his patients were going through a trial with Cytoxin, and I think it's going to be a 12-month study, and they were trying to get patients to join on the trial to find out what the effects of it would be going forward. This was in 2007. And he said that no one had completed this study as of yet. And so in doing this may help patients going forward. So I decided that one, this may benefit me, but it also may benefit countless others. And so I was more than happy to get started.
Well, that's incredible. And knowing that no one had completed the trials before you, what motivated you to participate in that trial? What was that like?
One, it was a little scary because we don't know what the outcome is. But two, at that time, there weren't very many other options. So I trust my doctor's judgment, and he felt like this would be a good option for me. And so I said, "Why not? Let's do it."
And was the experience what you expected it to be? And, was there anything you wish you knew before signing up for the trial?
Um, well, they always give you a list of side effects, things that may happen, may not happen. Um, So there's always that. There's a lot of adverse risk and things you just don't know because no one has fully completed it. So the unknown was a little scary, um, but I say that the good definitely outweighed the bad.
You. And then what would you tell someone who may be on the fence or is just now kind of getting interested in clinical trials? Is there anything you'd like to share with those folks?
Well, in my opinion, the clinical trials have been studied before they're offered to patients to try it. So I feel like if they're going to allow us to try it, then nothing is fully guaranteed, but there's a good chance that this is going to be more beneficial than it will be harmful. So if it's something that you're interested in, it's worth it not only for you, but maybe for countless other people who come after you once it gets officially approved.
Thank you, Kisa. It's very powerful. I appreciate you sharing your time with us and with the panelists and the attendees. Thank you. And I'd like to
Absolutely.
pass it to Dr. Tracy Frech for a presentation on the importance of clinical trials.
Perfect. I would like to start too by thanking Kisa because I think that was very powerful and an important message. And I think our goal today is really to go through what clinical trials in scleroderma are and how you can make the best decision for yourself whether a clinical trial is right for you. I really appreciate the invitation. I think the World of the National Scleroderma Foundation, who works very hard to make sure that our messages are messages of hope and opportunity. I have no relevant financial disclosures or conflicts of interest, and that's a particularly important bullet point there if you're talking about clinical trials or relationships with pharmaceutical companies. I feel very strongly that if I ever give advice to a company, that money goes directly to the Scleroderma Foundation. I have four main learning objectives today. The first is I'm going to talk about the different types of research studies. I think it can get confusing quickly if you don't really understand what the research study is designed to look at. I'm then going to examine the approach for you to consider taking when thinking about participating in a trial. We'll then discuss how can you critically appraise a study design. And why that's important, I think oftentimes you have questions for your physician. Does this drug work Should I try this intervention? And what the physician will do is to pull the clinical trials that have studied that drug or intervention and try to help you make an evidence-based decision. So it's particularly important to understand with our FDA-approved drugs for scleroderma, what did those studies look like, and do the patients that participated in that study appear similar to you? And then in order to do that well, we'll go through some of this clinical trial results and discuss meaningful outcomes that came out of those clinical trials, really to highlight some important points about clinical trials participation. So when we use the term medical research, realize that's a really broad-reaching term. There's sort of two big categories of research. There's primary research and secondary research. And that's really important if you're trying to think about what is this intervention and how does it apply to me? So a secondary research project takes all the similar studies, puts those together in maybe a review article and tell you sort of state of the art of certain treatments. A primary research project, in particular today we're going to focus on clinical research, comes in two buckets, and that's experimental research, and where that you're given an intervention or a placebo, or observational research, and that falls into the realm of registry-based work, so that you're in a registry and they're observing to see what outcomes come with a prescribed treatment. But with experimental research, if you're thinking about doing a clinical study, these are usually pharmaceutical-based studies, and they come in different phases. And what phase the study in is particularly important for you to understand and whether you want to participate. So I liked what Kheesa said about when you're thinking about a trial, there's probably pretty good data that the person conducting the trial believes this intervention is right for you. And that really spoke well to this thought of preclinical research. And that's oftentimes in animal models or cellular-based cultures, there's some concept that this drug may impact scleroderma. And then a phase 1 trial is looking at a small number of participants, and that drug is given, it's first in human, and they're giving that drug to understand the effects of that treatment in humans. Now, phase 2 and phase 3 is usually where people are participating in trials, and those studies are larger. In phase 2, there's really the importance of looking at the safety or efficacy of the treatment. And then that phase 2 gives you enough information that if it's positive, you move on to the phase 3 trial, and that's going to confirm the benefit and safety of the treatment and more participants, and that's usually in a larger global representation. A phase 4 trial looks at the long-term effects of the treatment over time, and that's usually over many years as opposed to phase 2 or phase 3 that has a shorter trial length. So I think it's really key. I always say I'm a simplistic person. So I say, when you're trying to make an important decision, you sort of break it down to sort of snippets of understanding to really make that decision. Is this trial right for me? So the most important thing is to understand what is the goal and the purpose of the study. And I think that seems simple, but oftentimes it's very hard to do that because the consents are oftentimes very, very long and have lots and lots of language. And so you really want to understand what is the investigator, what outcomes is that investigator trying to assess? And what is the design of that study, and what is the duration of the study? And that is particularly important for you to really delve into, because if the frequency of study visits means that you'll miss a lot of work or there's an impact on your life, that perhaps is not the right study for you. So I think really understanding the importance of commitment in the study is an important conversation up front. And then this is something that oftentimes is in the study protocol, but may not be clear to you when you're signing the consent. And that is, what are the inclusion and exclusion criteria for the study? So what patients are being included and what patients are being excluded? And why I highlight this as being an important question is because when you look at the exclusion criteria for the study, sometimes you can get an idea of whether another drug that's being excluded is something you haven't tried. So you really want to understand why you're being selected for that study, and are there alternative options for the study? Because oftentimes people say, well, I wanted to do the latest and greatest in research because I want access to the latest, greatest study drugs sooner than the general population. But you want to make sure you've tried all the therapies that have been thought to be effective to date. And I also like patients to know how many patients are included in the study. Is this just a study being done at one university? Is this a multi-center trial? And that's particularly important if we go back to question number 2 and you're sort of on the fence and you're like, oh, I don't really know if I can commit. If it's a study that only has 10 patients, and one of those patients drops out, that can really impact being able to make meaningful conclusions. And so it's really important, I always say, if you want to participate in a study, just sort of plan on really attending all the study visits so there's as much data as possible to analyze. So when we talk about studies, there's treatment studies, and that's really what we're talking about today. And then there's observational registry studies. And so the National Scleroderma Foundation was really pivotal back in 2011 for funding one of the very first national registries for systemic sclerosis. And what that did is it provided a wealth of data that we can look and analyze and describe data in different patients with 5 years disease duration of diffuse disease. And so this press registry that really started with the National Scleroderma Foundation really gave us a lot of good data. And so that's my plug for, even if you don't want to do an experimental research study, find out what registries are available and whether you can participate, because they have patient-reported outcomes and lots of different ways you can voice what's important to you for researchers to study. But today we're mostly talking about treatment studies, and that's clinical trials. And those come into 3 different types of buckets: randomized controlled trials, non-randomized controlled trials, and adaptive trials. So let's talk a little bit about what that means and how we can think through whether a study is right for you. So these are definitions, and why I generally, when I give talks, I hate definitions. This is the one talk you really do want to understand these definitions, because it really gives you a lot of details on the rigor of the study and what the outcomes mean. So a randomized trial is really important because that means study participants are randomly assigned to either receiving the placebo or the drug. And when it's randomized, that's important because it takes out bias. So as a physician, if I knew that someone's going to get placebo and someone's going to get drug, I might pick my sicker patient to get the drug. And so when it's randomized, the doctor doesn't make the decision, that the computer does. Open label studies are helpful, and so both the subject and the researcher knows which drug's being tested, but it often's a lot of bias because I, as your physician, really want you to get better, and you're taking a drug and you really want to get better. And so a blinded study means that the treatment is not known. If it's single blinded, excuse me, a single blinded study means the subject has no idea whether you're getting study drug or whether you're getting, excuse me, one more second. Okay, I'm good. So the single blinded means, as the participant, you don't know what you're getting. But I, as the prescribing physician, does know. And as we talked about, that can introduce bias. Now, a double blinded means you don't know what you're getting, nor the treating physician. And that's really important, again, because then the data is very clean. You don't have any bias, and I don't have any bias. A placebo is a substance that appears like the drug, but it's not active. Excuse me. So a placebo-controlled trial, double-blind randomized placebo-controlled trial, is the best type of trial because it introduces the least amount of bias. However, I prefer add-on trials where that everybody's getting a standard of care, and then you're testing an add-on intervention. So that's background therapy. And that's really important nowadays, because if you're trying to join a placebo-controlled trial, you want to make sure that you failed all the standard of care and you're not going right to, maybe you get the latest and greatest or you get a placebo, but you're not getting any background therapy. So a single center study is at one place, one location, one center, and that can have certain types of bias in the system. So a multi-center is much better, because if there's bias in different centers, it gets lost because you're comparing different center biases. So that goes away. So your best type of trial to draw a meaningful conclusion is a randomized, double-blind, placebo, or add-on with background therapy multi-center trial. Alrighty. So what are our key aspects of clinical trials? So you should understand that clinical trials are voluntary. So in order to be in a clinical trial, you must sign a consent to participate. And a clinical trial is designed by scientists to answer a specific question about the safety or effectiveness of an intervention. And it can test drugs or vaccines or therapies or new ways of using existing treatment. But there's always a question, and the trial is designed to get you to an answer. And so with that context, there's some things that you should know about when you're signing consent for clinical research. So we talked about the first one. Do you understand the objective of the research study? And why that's important is if your skin is really bothering you, but you're entering a drug trial for interstitial lung disease because you have mild lung disease, you'd really want to know, if the objective is not studying that symptom that's bothering you, what background therapy is allowed for your skin. And that really gets to, why do you qualify? So what are the inclusion criteria and what are the exclusion criteria? And that, again, we talked about if any of the exclusion criteria make more sense for your treatment choice, that allows you to know what is considered the standard of care. If you're receiving a placebo, what other treatments are allowed? And this is important because, remember, treatments aren't just drugs. So are you able to do phototherapy? Are there other things that are excluded if you're going to be in this trial? And again, we talked about the burden. So I think that's a really important concept. How many study visits, how long do those study visits last, and how long is the total duration of the study? And then I really like this point of this term called an open label extension. So an open label extension means after the trial's over, you absolutely get drug for a period of time after the trial is over. And so that's really important because that is a way, whether you are on the placebo or if you were receiving treatment drug, or the study drug, that you get that study drug at the end of the trial, and that can be given for a long period of time. And this is a really wonderful opportunity for patients. If it was the latest and greatest treatment for scleroderma, and you get that drug for free at the tail end of a treatment or a tail end of the trial period, that's really a great opportunity for a patient to get access to a treatment prior to it being FDA approved. So another important concept, which really I think it gets a little bit confusing when you're participating in a clinical trial, that perhaps you are seeing your regular doctor for your general care as well. And so I always think it's always interesting, if you've come for just a study visit, how that's different than a clinical care visit. And so you can sometimes see a doctor for your clinical care and for your clinical trial. And it's very different on how those visits are conducted and how those are designed. So we're going to go through that a bit. But I think it's really important to realize that if you're doing a clinical trial, you may not benefit from the clinical trial, and you may be exposed to unknown risk. And so, just like Kheesa said, you want to understand the trial, but really when you're participating, understand that there could be side effects and some things that come up during the trial that are unknown or are unexpected. So we'll go through now for the kind of key differences between clinical research and medical treatment. So a clinical research, we said, is designed to answer the specific question. So you get all these research volunteers, and then you look at the data that's generated. Whereas your medical treatment is always going to address your needs as an individual patient. So if you're seeing your doctor for your care visit, your doctor is going to listen to your list of problems and do a special intervention. Whereas if you're in a clinical trial, just the adverse effects will be recorded. And there may or may not be a lot that the doctor who's seeing you in that study visit can do, because it's trying to learn what are the adverse effects of the drug. The benefits in clinical research is that they're designed and intended to benefit future patients. So it's designed to get us the next latest and greatest treatment for scleroderma. Whereas when you're in clinic, we're just really trying to address your individual needs. The funding is generally by drug developers or government agencies in the form of grants when you're doing clinical research, whereas your medical treatment is going to be determined by your health plan. And why that's really important is I have some patients whose insurance plans don't cover a lot of options, and so they're more inclined to say, well, can I do a clinical trial? Because if that clinical trial allows for some background therapy to be paid, they may be more interested in the trial. So it's really important for you to understand, well, again, what drugs are available in your insurance plan for scleroderma. Should you be on those drugs, or have you failed all those drugs and now you're ready in the clinical research realm? The time frame for research protocol is very much dependent on the trial. So again, I can't stress enough how important it is for you to know what your time commitment is. And while for clinical research, you're going to sign a consent. For medical treatment, you generally don't. Your assessments are pretty standardized in a clinical research protocol, whereas your medical treatment may vary on what symptoms you're having. There's certain different protections and certainty in the test products that you're receiving. And this is another kind of key point. When you're in a clinical research protocol, all of the data that's generated by that clinical research protocol goes back to the company and is analyzed, and there's eventually a publication that comes back, and then you'll get the outcomes of the research study in its entirety. You don't get your individual level data back, and I think patients get a little bit frustrated with that. Whereas with your medical treatment, you have access to information on the labeling and through your medical records. So there's a different amount of access if you're in clinical research versus medical treatment. And again, I can't stress enough how valuable clinical research is and how much your information is so appreciated to be able to study both in the form of a registry or a test drug product. So important things when you're trying to read through the literature, and we're going to now just switch into that realm, asking those like sort of burning questions about background therapy, is again, you want to make sure that it's a randomized study. If it's not randomized, you're going to kind of take a little bit of a skepticism towards the results, because again, there could be bias introduced by the patient who really wanted to feel better, or the doctor who wanted the patient to feel better. There's blinding involved. That's, again, you're going to say, great, randomized and blinding reduce that bias, and I can believe these results a little bit more. Sample size, we'll talk about that a bit in the next study, but this is the number of participants that have to complete the trial in order to show the effectiveness of an intervention. And then again, we want to make sure that how those treatments are given, or in how the interpretation of the results are made, are really paying attention to differences between the groups. And this is really, really important in systemic sclerosis. It comes up all the time of how trial design is important. So if you don't want all your patients with one certain autoantibody to be in one group, you'd want just the same amount of SCL70 or RNA polymerase 3 or centromere antibodies to be randomly put in the placebo versus the treatment group. So you just have to make sure that the patients are split equally amongst the intervention. And that gets, as you know, a little bit difficult with systemic sclerosis, which has some heterogeneity of disease features. So let's talk through, I'm going to give by example 3 different trials, and we're going to apply the different criteria that I asked you to think through when you're trying to both participate in a research study, but also when you're reading the literature and you're saying, does this make sense for me? So let's talk through this phase 2, so you all know what that means now, randomized control trial of oral prednisolone in early diffuse systemic sclerosis. And as this audience knows, we use prednisone super cautiously because of the risk of renal crisis. And renal crisis is highest in early disease with diffuse skin disease. So this was a really important study to look at, well, patients who get low-dose prednisolone maybe feel better. So is it truly that we're too scared to use this drug when we just need to use it with a bit more data? So the purpose of their study is they wanted to examine the safety and the efficacy of moderate dose prednisolone in patients with early diffuse scleroderma, and they wanted to specifically evaluate whether this dose of prednisolone reduced pain and disability and improved skin score, and whether it was safe for renal function. So clear aim, clear objectives, and now let's talk through the design. So the design, I would say, if I was a patient participating in this, was not too laborious. The number of visits were baseline, 6 weeks, 3 months, and 6 months. And they used randomization, and then that's why I introduced that concept of allocation concealment of stratified by autoantibody, 1-to-1. So you're either getting the prednisolone or you're getting placebo, and you don't know, and your doctor doesn't know what you're getting. What patients were included? These were patients that were greater than or equal to 18 years of age with diffuse skin involvement within 3 years of their first noted skin thickening. And then again, who were excluded? And this really highlights some kind of key points, I think, of when we think through exclusion, why it's so important to do so. So they wanted to make sure they excluded patients who had previously received steroids within the last 4 weeks. And I just point that out because ideally this would have been patients who were currently on or ever received steroids, because you could argue this introduced some bias if someone tried a little low dose steroids 5 weeks ago and they handled it just fine. They might be more inclined to be in the study because they felt like they did okay on it. They then did some exclusion based on other immunosuppressants, whether they had blood pressure that was uncontrolled. And then, one second. Patients that had chronic infections, diabetes, and that all makes sense. But here's another thing. Patients with major muscle inflammation or inflammatory arthritis were excluded. And they gave the example of patients that had really high levels of muscle inflammation or inflammation that was demonstrable on MRI. And so ideally, patients that we would use steroids for muscle inflammation, if we were really trying to understand the kind of safety and efficacy for skin and pain and disability, we would have excluded those patients. And so I just point out that, again, going through the exclusion criteria really helps you understand how to apply the results. So next, we're going to go to primary outcomes. So I know I don't need to, for this audience, to talk about probably a modified Rodnan skin score much, but I will point out it's really limited us a bit in getting drugs to the FDA for skin treatment. So your doctor's pinching your skin in these 17 different areas and saying whether the skin is normal, mildly, moderately, or severely involved. And then this is going to be done every visit to look at change of skin over time. And then looking at the health assessment questionnaire gets at sort of the totality of the disease and different activities of daily living. And so these are the two things that they're giving the prednisolone versus the placebo, and they're trying to decide whether this drug has efficacy. So when we look at how many patients were needed for the study, they do what's called a power calculation. And so they tell you how many patients have to be in this study in order to detect a baseline difference. And then usually what a drug company will do is they'll add additional patients to account for ones that may drop out of the study. And as you can see here, which was very sad for this study, was that they weren't able to meet their numbers by by a significant amount, and that was because of COVID. So here's this incredibly important study, well designed with excellent investigators, really trying to answer a very important question, and we really can't answer too much in the way of meaningful conclusions. However, we do get some information based on looking at the outcome. So you can see trends in the right direction. And I think what's really very important, even though they weren't powered, they saw a significant difference in pain. And so that's sort of an interesting observation in the sense that we were able to see a positive signal with this drug and without being powered for outcomes. So what would we say that we learned from this double-blind placebo randomized control trial? The goal, again, was looking at the safety and efficacy for steroid use in early scleroderma with diffuse skin involvement. And we can't draw meaningful conclusions because they weren't powered, or they were powered, but they didn't meet their enrollment numbers. And again, no fault of their own. It was COVID, and it was halted because prednisone was not a good idea during COVID. And again, if I was a patient thinking about participating, I think is a very reasonable duration, 4 visits in 6 months. And one of the things I will point out, They couldn't allocate patients by the anti-RNA3 polymerase antibody, which is an antibody that's known to correlate with renal crisis. And they had patients that were not steroid naive, so I think those are two limits in the design. However, I think while we can't reach robust conclusions, there was certainly no safety signal in the short duration in the small number of patients for renal crisis. And so I think it was a very important contribution to the literature. But if you came to me in clinic and you said, hey, Tracy, what do you think about low dose, and they call it moderate dose, but low dose for prednisolone or prednisone for use in early scleroderma, I'd say we still don't have an answer. And I can't really have robust conclusions unless the trial was complete with numbers. Though certainly there were no major safety signals seen in this study. So let's move on then to our kind of two famous phase 2, phase 3 trials in systemic sclerosis, because we have two FDA approved drugs for systemic sclerosis. And both of these trials were really well done with lots of different investigators very dedicated to the field of systemic sclerosis. And so the first one was fascinating. This is looked at tocilizumab, which is a phase 2 randomized clinical trial. And while that important kind of outcome of this phase 2 was it was not associated with significant reduction in skin thickening. However, they felt that they saw some signal and they decided to move on to a phase 3. So I participated in this trial, and I was fairly excited for the phase 3. But I actually did not participate in the phase 3 because by that time, this was a placebo-controlled trial, and mycophenolate became available on formulary. So we now had a drug we could get for patients. So I was not involved in the phase 3 trial because I didn't want the placebo in the background. But this was a really interesting study, and perhaps the first, not only for systemic sclerosis, but globally. While the study was looking at skin fibrosis outcome, and it didn't meet it for skin, so the drug did not work for the skin modified Rodnan skin score, it did help lung function. So the FDA said, okay, even though this primary outcome for skin was not met, we really are impressed with the data and the rigor of the study design. And we're going to say, you know what, this is a drug for lung fibrosis, and it got FDA approval. And so that's really was huge for our community and really an example of the importance of clinical trials work. However, the cautionary tale I usually will give patients is when looking at this clinical trial, these results apply to diffuse scleroderma. So you need to have involvement above your elbows and your knees and your abdomen, but the disease duration must be less than 5 years disease duration. And they really enrich the population for markers of inflammation. And so I really say you have to make sure if you're going to think about this drug that you were actually the type of patient that would have been treated. And so really understanding what we call the table 1 or who the participants were. Does that patient in that table 1 look like you? Because just because there's an FDA approved drug for scleroderma doesn't mean it's right for everyone. It's really in the context of the patients that were studied. So let's move in the last portion of the talk to really talk about what are kind of the latest and greatest in trial design. And so a basket trial design means there are multiple diseases, and let's use the example of interstitial lung disease. So in this, a patient with myositis-related lung disease, perhaps lupus-related lung disease, and scleroderma-related lung disease would all receive the same drug, and then you would look at the patients at the primary outcome of perhaps their forced vital capacity. So all the patients, though they have different diseases, are receiving a targeted intervention, and then they're analyzed. In an umbrella trial design, there's a single disease, so all of our patients have scleroderma, but they're all getting different targeted interventions, and then those outcomes are compared. And so a targeted intervention, like perhaps this patient does pulmonary rehabilitation, this patient receives a targeted drug, and this patient, or an oral drug, and this has an inhaled drug. And so they're just different interventions looking at the same disease and looking at the same primary outcome. Now, the kind of newest kid on the block is this platform clinical trial design. And this is where patients are enrolled with scleroderma, and they can either receive the standard of care or they can have different interventions. And what the beauty of a platform trial design is as new drugs become available, they can be enrolled in the same protocol. And so this means it allows new patients coming in and new drugs being tested on the same background standard, and that the standard of care in the background, you're not having a lot of placebo patients because everyone's sharing the same trial design. And then at the end, there's a final analysis of the outcomes. And so this was particularly interesting to the scleroderma community because of the conquest study that got launched looking at different interventions for scleroderma ILD. And it really raised the question, I think maybe perhaps that's why I was asked, is like, oh, there's so many different interventions now being tested in scleroderma, and there's so many different trial designs. So why would a patient want to participate in an adaptive clinical trial design? So these are considered learning health systems. So it's really trying to embed clinical trials in the routine standard of care. And so it's really trying to say, let's do standard of care in the background and then test different interventions in the background. And the focus of the adaptive platform trial design is really the disease or the condition rather than a particular intervention. So this is the scleroderma community saying, okay, scleroderma is out there. There's different interventions we can try. How do we best study multiple different interventions in a rare disease? And again, as I mentioned on the last slide, the shared control group really minimizes the heterogeneity between placebo or comparative groups and reduces the number of patients that have to use placebo. So it's a way to really let lots of different companies come together and work in the scleroderma community. And so the next question would be like, well, why would a researcher want to use an adaptive platform clinical trial design? And it's really easier to get studies to patients from a cost to regulatory standpoint. And this got a lot of press, and people really kind of started calling and saying, gosh, wow, there's all these different companies that are spending lots of money to study scleroderma. Isn't that like a really good and exciting thing? And it is from lots of different standpoints of doing research. It really helps with like managing the data and regulatory items and sort of just streamlining computers and suppliers and regulations. So there's a lot of streamline effects of this. But one of the issues that came up is this still doesn't replace the importance of investigator-initiated clinical trial design. So this is where an investigator, somebody who takes care of lots of scleroderma patients and really has a lot of different experience with different treatments that may be effective, says, hey, I really think I want to study this particular treatment because I take care of a lot of patients and they have told me this. And I'll use the example of low-dose naltrexone. That was an investigator-initiated clinical trial. So this is where a company may provide the medication. So the investigator, I would write to a company and say, hey, I want to study this medication. Will you give me that medication so I can study it? The company doesn't own the data. They don't do the analysis. They don't do anything but provide the medication. And the financing is really provided by the investigator. So the investigator has to find grants. And I really give a shout out to the National Scleroderma Foundation and Scleroderma Research Foundation. These are where an investigator says, hey, I have a drug. I think it's going to work for scleroderma. And so the investigator writes a grant, puts it to a foundation. Foundation may fund this source. And so there's really no conflicts of interest. And it's just a way of studying the drug in an objective manner. And I'll give this example of another really important question that comes up a lot with in clinic is what about rituximab? So where should rituximab enter my treatment plan? And the data we have really comes out of our wonderful colleagues in Japan, who wanted to understand both the safety and efficacy of Rituxan. So they were funded to do this, but then they did this most beautiful open label extension at the tail end of their trial. So they do the trial, they study it, and then they continue to follow patients. And it provided a lot of really helpful information because their purpose was, they said, well, we can look at this double-blind phase 2 trial that shows Rituxan improves skin thickening, but now we want to study it longer when everybody's getting the drug and really understand safety outcomes. And this was a really important study because we didn't know the answer. We could give a little rituximab, but we didn't know how long we can give it and what safety outcomes should we look for. And so the study design again was looking at the open label extension of safety in all patients that continue to receive Rituxan. And so again, really important if you're on the call and you're like, I wonder if this applies to me. These were patients were aged 20 to 79, and I will make a pitch. The Scleroderma Clinical Trials Consortium is really doing more of a concerted effort to study pediatrics and getting studies to our younger patient population, but for the most part, you'll see age 18 and up. Classification criteria for systemic sclerosis, modified Rodnan skin score had to be greater than 10. Patients had to be expected to survive at least 6 months. And that's really important because sometimes historically patients had tried every single drug. And so patients come and want to try the latest and greatest study drug. And that if a patient's really sick, a clinical trial is not the best place for their care. They shouldn't be getting placebo. They should be getting a very focused care on them as an individual. And then in this trial, patients had received intravenous rituximab that they got weekly for 4 weeks. And what were the results here? And I don't love super busy slides, but I really wanted to talk through this with you all because I think that there's some really important points. So the first was luck. They did this study before the COVID pandemic because this was a super important question, and they were able to do this study because at this time frame in Japan, you could not get mycophenolate. So there was no option for any background therapy. So patients in Japan either got the Rituxan or a placebo in a double-blind fashion. And then 24 participants that had already been on Rituxan continued on Rituxan, and then 19 patients who had been on the placebo then got Rituxan. And why this is so important is the Rituxan to Rituxan group continued to improve. So it wasn't that you treat someone shortly and then you think of this induction and then you switch to Cellcept or you switch to a different drug. These are patients continue to get to the same drug. And they continue to see even further improvement. So it really gave us a good safety signal that if you continue to dose Rituxan, you'll continue to get better. And then in our placebo Rituxan group, we're seeing patients, they worsened, as you'd expect. So they were on placebo, they didn't get anything. There was no background therapy, but they improved at week 48. And so this really showed that this drug treatment was safe. There was one serious event of inflammation of the gallbladder and pneumonia, but there were no deaths. And so what we really took this to mean, 2 courses of Rituxan is safe treatment from that paid for study, but the open label extension really showed a sustained improvement for at least 48 weeks. And what I really love to highlight that outcomes that matter to physicians and patients are best captured over time in the investigator-initiated clinical trials. And that sometimes when it's a drug study, costs limit the number of these that can be done or that government sponsored. But I really, again, give a big shout out to these physicians that continue to do this safety data, because what they did is they showed us that skin and lung continue to improve, and they continue meticulously recording these adverse effects. So they really helped us understand that this drug has purpose and a place in the scleroderma community. So to summarize, I really hope that I captured some important things or some important items for you. So when you're thinking about a clinical trial, the first is if you're thinking about participating in a clinical trial, make sure you understand the goal. Make sure you understand what is the standard of care and will you be receiving that. Understand if there's a placebo arm that's being added to that standard of care, and is there an open label extension at the tail end of the clinical trial that'll allow you for sure to get drug, and who owns that data that's generated by the study. And that again is important because you may not get your data back until it's published, and so it's really important to again, if you're participating in a clinical trial, to ask those basic questions. And then it's critically important to discuss research results from clinical trials with your providers. And so oftentimes there's news flashes that come out and say, oh, there's this drug that may be available for systemic sclerosis. Make sure you understand, how did the patients that were in that trial compare to where your disease features were? How long were they in disease compared to you? And what was that primary outcome that was studied, and was significant reach? So was it a skin trial or a lung trial? And I really put a pitch there because there's no trials that really look at GI tract outcomes. And so there's a lot of space and things that are coming in scleroderma. And so it's really important that you understand what's the right trial for you. And really, what did the long-term follow-up show? And sometimes that doesn't come out for years after. And so with that, I wanna thank you for attending this conference and contributing to clinical research. And I'm gonna stop sharing. Happy to answer questions, or Angel, for saving those for the end, that's fine too.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Dr. Frech. Yeah, we're just going to pass it to Abdul, and then from there, we'll jump into the Q&A section. Abdul, you're good to share your slide. Thank you.
Okay. Are you able to see my screen?
Yep, looks good.
Hi everyone, my name is Abdul Rehman. I'm a clinical research coordinator here at Northwell Division of Rheumatology, located in New York. We usually work with patients who have SLE, scleroderma, lupus nephritis, RA, and other autoimmune diseases. And today I will just be providing a brief overview of what happens from a coordinator side, and also like a little bit from the patient's point of view. So some of the most common ways we recruit patients is investigators' patients. So let's say an investigator is seeing a patient and they think that the current treatment that the patient is on is not really helping them. And they think that the current trial that's going on might be a better option for that patient. That way, an investigator will initiate the conversation with the patient, that's telling them about the trial and what treatment they might be given to them. The other way is screening through our database. So we as a coordinator go through our database and see who meets criteria, like inclusion exclusion criteria, and see if any of the patients that we currently have coming to our clinic qualify for one of the clinical trials. And if we do see it, then we would take that patient to the provider and see if they also agree. The third option is patients doing their own research and they come along clinicaltrials.gov website and then they see a trial being conducted for a disease that they currently have and they might be interested in that. So they can contact the study team through the website and then see if they actually meet the criteria or not. So when we have found a patient who meets the criteria, we'll reach out to the patient. So what I would like to do is call the patient first and then explain a brief overview of the study and see if they actually are interested in the study. So I'll explain what the study is, what will happen to them during the study, and see if they're interested. And then if they are, then we would just schedule a quick appointment with the provider for them to come into the office and talk about the study and see if they're interested in joining. So if they are interested in joining, then we would go through the consenting process. So the consenting process is one of the main parts of enrolling someone, in which we go through the consent form in its entirety. So a consent form is usually around like 20 to 30 pages long. And we would, like, the coordinator and the provider will be in there with the patient and then make sure that the patient understand what they are enrolling for and explain all the side effects, the treatment they will be getting, what the treatment is, what the treatment will do, and what to expect during the study. And we also make sure that before the patient signs the consent form, if they have any questions or concerns, we answer those. And then make sure the patient is on board with the trial, of course. So after the consent has been signed, we move to the screening process. So the whole point of the screening visit is just to see that the patient actually meets those criteria. So of course, before we even sign the consent form, we look at the patient's labs that were done in previously, but we can't really use those labs to enroll the patient. We need to do our own labs to make sure they actually meet the criteria for the study. which will qualify them. So some of those things are, let's say, urine or blood collection, EKG, chest X-ray, CT scan, or echo, or something like that. It's different based on each study. And here is a quick example of what a schedule of assessments looks like. So a schedule of assessment is basically a chart which explains everything that will be happening to the patient during the study. So let's say screening visit, which is the first visit that will be done after the consent. So during the screening visit, we will do consent the subject. We will do blood tests, EKG, medical history, or a physical exam, or any other assessments that needs to be done. And then this is different based on the study. This is just an example. It's not same thing for every study, and then this will be done for that specific visit. This chart is usually present in the consent form, but it also provided to the patient. So we make sure that the patient has this with them. So let's say the screening visit is done, the upcoming visit is the first baseline visit. So the patient just knows what to expect from their visit. So they would know what exactly will be done during that visit, and there's no surprises. So after the screening is done, the patient has passed the screening, they move on to the treatment period. So the treatment period varies based on the study, but it's usually around, for a drug trial, is usually around, let's say, 25 to 54 weeks long. But that doesn't mean that we expect the patients to come in every single week for a whole year. No. Mainly what happens is, for most of the studies, like the beginning few visits will be, let's say, once a week for a month. And then as you go further along in the study, the visits will be further apart. So the first month of the study might be every week, but then as you move along to, let's say, the second month, it will be every other week. Then it will move on to every other month, then every few months. And then it will just spread out like that throughout the study. And then during each visit, of course, you will be given the treatment medication. And then same thing will be done, the vitals, blood work, urine, just to see how you're improving and what's happening to you. And yeah. And then after the treatment period is done, we move on to the follow-ups. Follow-ups are around usually 3 to 6 months long, but they will be much further apart. So it will be every, like, let's say 2 months. You just have to come in, and then we'd usually do blood work and urine collection and physical, just to see how you're doing. And then if you have had any side effects from the treatment medication. This is just to make sure that the patients are doing well, there's nothing going wrong, and we're not just leaving the patient on their own after they have received the medication. So some of the common questions and concerns that we usually get from the patients is, am I obligated to stay in the study until the end? No. Some patients think that they're signing their life away as they sign the consent form, but that's not true at all. So even if you're like 2 weeks in the study or 6 months in the study, and at any time you feel like you don't want to continue the study or it's not improving your health, then you have the right to, at any point, be removed from the study. You just have to ask the provider then, oh, I'm not interested in the study anymore. I don't think it's helping me. And you will be removed without any consequences or penalties. 2 is, will it affect my current treatment? So this one is a yes or no. For most trials and most medication, you are allowed to continue the medication throughout the treatment of the study. But some medications might be that are exclusion criteria for the study. So you might be asked to be off that medication for a certain amount of time during the treatment period, which is just because it might affect the treatment you will receive. So of course, this will be discussed with your doctor, and then make sure that the potential treatment you will be receiving outweighs the medication you will be off of. Who will pay for this treatment? So few patients might think that, oh, it sounds like a very expensive treatment and I don't know how my insurance will cover it or what happens. But most of the, like all of the visits that are done and then all of the assessments, let's say a chest x-ray or a CT scan that's done for the study will be covered by the study. So your insurance will not even be involved. There will nothing be like billed to your insurance or anything like that. So whatever is done, the blood test and everything will be free to the patient and will be covered by the company. Am I able to reach out to someone if I have any questions and concern during the study? So for this one, the coordinator is usually the main point of contact for the patients. I make sure that my patients always have my direct contact number in case they have any questions or concerns about anything. And when they do reach out to me, I always make sure to, if it's a provider related question, I ask them. If it's a study team, whoever it is, I always make sure that their question is answered as soon as possible. And I also understand that some patients are scared about their disease and make sure that they're never left alone or feeling alone during this whole process. And lastly, what if I don't have a car and I can't afford an Uber? So in New York, not everyone has a car because we have a lot of transportation. So if seems necessary that a patient needs to take an Uber or put gas in the car if they're coming from far and then they have to fill up the whole tank every single time and they don't want to pay that $50, $60, $70 for each visit. Some studies or most studies usually do provide a reimbursement. So you just bring in the receipt of the gas and then those studies will pay whatever the amount was. It takes 2 to 3 weeks to get the money, but we usually do try our best to reimburse the patients for whatever the travel they pay to come for their study appointment. And some studies do provide stipend amounts. So for the patient's time and effort to come into the site during the day and then take out time from their busy schedules. So that was it from my side. If any questions and concern, you guys can ask in the Q&A.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Abdul, and thank you to all of our panelists today. Thank you, Dr. Frech. Thank you, Kheesa. Thank you, Abdul. I'd like to open up the Q&A portion. We've got a few questions here. I'll jump in and ask those. So one of our questions here is, I've been asked to participate in a study entitled Phenotyping Project. It's for Raynaud's and it's through the Mayo Clinic. They're wondering, what category does this fall into in terms of a research study?
Yeah, great question. So that's an observational research study. So the way you can think about it, if you're just filling out questionnaires and someone's studying your disease over time without giving you an intervention, that is observational clinical research. So it's still clinical research and you signed a consent to participate, but you're not getting an intervention. A clinical trial is where you're getting either a placebo or an intervention, and they're comparing the outcomes of that. So for a phenotype study, that is likely just a clinical observational research study. And you shouldn't need to do much besides have someone examine you and fill out some questionnaires on how you're feeling. Good question.
Thank you, Dr. Frech. And this is a question we see all the time. So it's a person who's been diagnosed over 10 years and they're wondering if they can still qualify for trials or what are kind of their options.
Fantastic question. And the answer is yes. Normally, we think of the most disease activity occurring in the first 5 years of disease. So that's really why a lot of the clinical trials are limited to the first 5 years of disease, because there's thought to be like a more rapid change. However, studies that are looking at for Raynaud's, for example, or digital ulcers will include patients that have longer stage disease. There's not as many trials because most of the trials are targeting skin and lung, but there are trial options certainly coming down the pipeline, really trying to understand longer disease duration. Registry participation is almost universally available The larger national registries that compare data usually are earlier disease, but in a scleroderma center, for instance, at our scleroderma center, you can have any type of scleroderma, and we'll look at neofold capillaroscopy and sublingual vascular changes. So it's just finding usually options are only available at scleroderma centers, and then those options usually are looking more at the vascular outcome measures rather than change in skin score or change in lung. A good question.
So thank you so much. And we got a few questions before the trial that were sent in. This one here is, can I participate in more than one trial at a time?
Yeah, great question. So you can technically, if you're in a registry-based study, so there's observational data and you're doing a clinical trial. So that's really the only type of like clinical research that would allow 2 trials. If you're doing a clinical intervention study, by usually the exclusion criteria, you can only do 1 at a time because they're testing the intervention compared to placebo. And so if you're on also another investigational drug, you would be excluded. But we have lots of patients that are in registries and then do a clinical trial. Of course, when you're doing the registry, you list under drugs, investigational drugs, so we don't know what you're getting. But yes, the technical answer is yes. Though you really do want to, any trial or research you're in, you want to make sure you're telling the treating physician so they're aware of what you're taking, what you're involved in.
So that's really good to know. Next we have, do I need to be a patient at the institution conducting the clinical trial to participate?
No, so that's a great question. So there usually, and National Scleroderma Foundation does a great job at this. Scleroderma centers will have a contact for just research versus clinical care. I personally really love to see patients for at least 1 care visit, so I get to know them and know what's important to them and really try to understand where they're at, because a research clinic visit is a little bit different. It's like a checkbox form, and you're kind of going through criteria and looking at someone else's records. So I think it's usually in the patient's best interest to see at least do 1 care visit with the provider, just to make sure you understand why you're included and what the exclusions are. And then certainly if you have a local rheumatologist, but you're kind of flying in for research visits, that is an arrangement that's done. A lot of the pharmaceutical companies have money to provide transportation costs. I thought it was a great point of Abdul's. That's a good question. If you really want to do a study, but getting to the center is a limitation.
Thank you. And you touched on this a bit in your presentation, but if a trial, treatment, or medication is working, can I continue to take it after the trial has concluded?
Yeah, no, great question. So that's really where the open label extension becomes really important. So if the drug trial you're in has an open label extension, the answer is yes, that you'll continue on that drug for a period of time within that protocol. If the clinical trial you're in does not have an open label extension, once the trial's over, access to the drug is over, both for you and the physician. Now, the one caveat to this is if something's being studied that's available, that's not very expensive and it's available, that you could get it. So I'll use the example of scleroderma lung study. So in the scleroderma lung study, where CellCept was versus Cytoxan was looked at, or in the scleroderma lung study 1 where Cytoxan versus placebo was looked at the end of that trial, once it was over, if a patient felt that they were better and it's like later down, the trial is completely over, that patient could ask their physician for access to those drugs, and the pharmaceutical, if you could appeal and get access to the drug, then the prescribing physician would be able to prescribe it. But for most clinical trials, it's an investigational drug that's not FDA approved or not available. The doctor can't prescribe it. So it really depends on what is the trial, what's the treatment being studied, and can the doctor access it without outside of the clinical trial.
Thank you, Dr. Frech. So we'll do kind of a last call for questions. If anyone has any questions, please pop those in the Q&A. And then while folks work on that, the last question we've got here that was sent prior was, will participating in a clinical trial potentially exclude me from participating in trials in the future?
No, that's a really good question. Usually there's a washout period, so you have to be off of the investigational drug for a certain amount of time, and then you can participate in the next trial that you want to do. Now the exception, and that's where the exclusion criteria are really important, unless it's an ever sort of statement. So if you were in a trial and they said you can never have received treatment with a B cell depleting therapy ever, then you would be disqualified. So it's a little tricky because you don't know what the latest and greatest coming down the pipeline is. I will say for most drug protocols, there's just a washout. So you just have to wait enough time and then you become eligible.
Awesome. Thank you. It's all very good information. I don't see any questions here, so I want to give an opportunity for each of our panelists if there's any closing comments that you'd like to give to the audience today. And this webinar has been recording, so that message can also be for anyone viewing this recording in the future as well.
No, thanks so much for having me. I really appreciate it. Sorry for the laryngitis and the coughing fit.
Oh, no worries. Oh, and we did get one last question. Where is the best place to find clinical trials? I know we have clinicaltrials.org. We also have CareBox with Dr. Frech. I know, you and Abdul do this all the time. So what would you recommend?
Yeah, I like the NIH trials. So clinicaltrials.gov is a good place to look for recruiting trials. That means that they're investigator initiated, they're published their protocols, there's access, all that. So I do think that's a good place to look. But I really shout out for the National Scleroderma Foundation. Once a year, any scleroderma center needs to go through what trials they have available and provide that information to the National Scleroderma Foundation. Alternatively, if a site gets behind and doesn't have it all up to date, the National Scleroderma Foundation will reach out to the investigator and say, hey, I have a patient that lives in this state or this area and is interested in what trials opportunities. So I think the National Scleroderma Foundation is probably the best place to go for trying to figure out what's out there, but also clinicaltrials.gov is a great resource.
So thank you so much, Dr. Frech. With that, I'd like to say thank you again to you for joining us today. Thank you, Abdul. Thank you, Kheesa, for donating your time and expertise for this fantastic session. I also want to give a thank you to our sponsors, Amgen Rare Disease and Merck, for sponsoring today's webinar. This webinar has been recorded and will be made available on our YouTube page in about a week. So if you have any questions or want to check that out, you can email us at info@scleroderma.org or check out our YouTube page in about a week. Thank you so much to everyone who participated today, and I hope you have a wonderful day.